Episode 1. The Eastern Shadow. There are places in this world where the old darkness never lifted, where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin as mist, where something ancient and hungry watches from crumbling towers and waits with the patience of centuries. Jonathan Harker didn't believe in such places. He believed in contracts and property law, in railway timetables and the steady march of progress that had illuminated even the remotest corners of Europe with the bright lamp of reason. He believed in these things right up until the moment the carriage stopped at the precipice, until the driver who cast no shadow turned to him with eyes that reflected the moon like an animal's, until he heard his own voice, small and afraid, ask a question to which he already knew and dreaded the answer. But that moment still lay hours ahead as his train rattled eastward through the Carpathian spring, carrying him toward a castle he'd seen only on a map, toward a client he knew only through elegant letters written in a precise, old-fashioned hand, toward a truth that would shatter everything he understood about the world and his place in it. This is where it begins, not with blood, not yet, but with a journey, with warnings unheeded, with the terrible inevitability of a door opening onto darkness and a voice, cultured and cold, saying words that sound like welcome but taste like doom. The morning Jonathan left London, Mina had kissed him at the station with a brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was a schoolteacher, practical and intelligent, not given to superstition or feminine vapors, but something in this particular journey had unsettled her. Perhaps it was simply the distance, the foreign strangeness of it all, or perhaps it was the dream she'd mentioned once and then refused to discuss, the one about a vast shadow spreading westward across a map of Europe, engulfing everything in its path. He'd laughed it away, reminded her that this assignment from Hawkins & Sons was a tremendous opportunity, that Count Dracula's purchase of property in England represented exactly the sort of continental client that could establish his reputation. He'd return in a month, 6 weeks at most, and when he came back they'd finally set the wedding date they'd been postponing. She'd smiled and nodded and tightened her grip on his hand until her knuckles went white, and he'd felt for just a moment like a man standing on the edge of an abyss he couldn't see, only sense in the sudden cold that raised the hair on his neck. Then the conductor had called for boarding and the moment passed and he'd stepped onto the train that would carry him to Dover, to Calais, to Vienna, to Budapest, and finally to this small rattling local railway that served the remote eastern reaches where the Carpathians rose like a wall between civilization and something older. The journey had taken 5 days. With each passing mile the trains grew older, the stations smaller, the faces of his fellow passengers more weathered and foreign. German gave way to Hungarian, then to Romanian mixed with other languages he couldn't identify, ancient dialects that seemed to carry the weight of mountains and forests in their harsh consonants. The landscapes transformed as well. The ordered fields and prosperous towns of Western Europe gradually yielded to wilder country, vast forests of pine and oak, villages that looked medieval in their construction, roads that were little more than mud tracks. By the 4th day Jonathan found himself checking and rechecking the Count's letters, reassuring himself that this was indeed the correct route, that a nobleman of substance truly did reside at the end of this increasingly improbable journey. The letters themselves were remarkable, written in English of such formal precision it seemed almost archaic, discussing property law and London real estate with the expertise of a scholar, yet containing odd phrases and references that suggested their author's knowledge came from books rather than experience, from study rather than life. There was something hungry in those letters, Jonathan had thought once and then dismissed the notion as fancy, a hunger not for property itself but for what it represented, for presence, for proximity to the great teeming heart of the modern world. The train reached Bistritz in the late afternoon, wheezing into the small station as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. Jonathan gathered his luggage, the leather valise containing the property documents and contracts, the trunk with a month's worth of clothes, and stepped onto the platform into air so fresh and cold it shocked his London-accustomed lungs. The town was larger than he'd expected, prosperous in a rustic way, with solid buildings and a main square dominated by an old church. The Count's letter had instructed him to spend the night at the Golden Crown Hotel, where arrangements had been made, and to take the coach to Bukovina the following afternoon. But Jonathan found himself with several hours to spare and a restless energy that made the thought of sitting in a hotel room intolerable. He left his trunk at the Golden Crown, confirmed that yes, a room had indeed been reserved in his name, paid in advance by the Count himself, and set out to explore the town while the light lasted. Bistritz seemed ordinary enough at first, a market town serving the surrounding agricultural regions, but Jonathan soon noticed details that struck him as strange. The churches were more numerous than the size of the population seemed to warrant, and their architecture incorporated odd defensive features: heavy doors reinforced with iron, windows set high and narrow. Crosses appeared everywhere, not merely on steeples but carved into doorways, painted on shutters, wrought into the ironwork of gates. In the main square, vendors were selling early spring produce, but also stranger items: bundles of dried herbs with pungent unfamiliar scents, small cloth bags that clinked with what sounded like coins or stones, tokens, and amulets of tarnished silver. The people themselves seemed ordinary enough, going about their business with the unhurried efficiency of those living close to the land's rhythms, but Jonathan noticed that when he asked for directions or attempted simple pleasantries in his guidebook German, they looked at him with a kind of pitying concern that made him inexplicably uncomfortable. It was an old woman selling early roses at a corner stall who finally broke the pattern of polite evasion. Jonathan had stopped to admire the blooms, thinking he might purchase a few to press and send to Mina, and had mentioned in his halting German that he was traveling to meet the Count, to Bukovina and beyond. The old woman's face had transformed, weathered features collapsing into an expression of such naked horror that Jonathan actually stepped back. She'd begun speaking rapidly in Romanian, words spilling over each other, and though he couldn't understand the language, the tone was unmistakable, pleading, warning. She'd grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her other hand fumbling at her neck to pull free a small silver crucifix on a leather cord, and before he could protest she'd pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it, her own hands trembling. Her eyes, he would remember later, had been full of tears, desperate and knowing, the eyes of someone watching a lamb being led to slaughter and powerless to prevent it. She'd spoken one word he recognized, repeated 3 times like an incantation or a curse: Nosferatu. Jonathan had tried to return the crucifix, explaining he couldn't possibly accept such a personal item, but the woman had backed away, shaking her head, still speaking in that rapid, desperate Romanian, and other vendors and passers-by had gathered, their faces carrying that same expression of pity and fear. Someone had said in broken German, "You go to the castle? You go to him." When Jonathan had confirmed that yes, he had business with the Count, the small crowd had exchanged glances weighted with meaning he couldn't decipher. An old man had muttered something that caused several people to make a sign against evil, fingers and thumb positioned in a gesture Jonathan had seen in books about peasant superstitions. The situation had begun to feel absurd and uncomfortable in equal measure, and Jonathan had retreated, the crucifix still in his hand because he literally couldn't find a way to return it without causing more distress, feeling the weight of their stares until he rounded a corner and the market square disappeared from view. Back at the Golden Crown, he'd found a letter waiting for him, delivered by hand during his absence. The handwriting was unmistakable, the Count's precise script on heavy paper that felt expensive and old. The message was brief: "My friend, welcome to my country. I trust your journey has been pleasant. Tomorrow the coach departs at 3 in the afternoon. You will be the only passenger. Do not be alarmed if the driver seems unfamiliar with modern courtesies. These mountain people retain the old ways. The journey to my castle takes 4 hours if the roads are good. I await your arrival with great anticipation. Sleep well, and do not let the local fancies disturb your rest." These simple folk carry many superstitions from darker times, but you and I are men of the modern world, are we not? Until tomorrow evening, I remain your obedient servant, Dracula. Jonathan had read the letter twice, unsettled by its timing, by the dismissive reference to local superstitions that seemed to acknowledge exactly what had happened in the market square, as though the Count had eyes and ears throughout the town. He'd gone to dinner in the hotel's restaurant, where the landlord had served him an excellent meal of roasted meat and local wine while maintaining a careful distance, a professional warmth that didn't extend to actual friendliness. When Jonathan had mentioned his destination, the landlord's hand had trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of wine as he poured. "Sir," he'd said in careful German, "it is not my place to question a gentleman's business, but I must ask, are you certain? The castle, it is very remote, very old. The Count, he is not often visited. Perhaps your business could be conducted by correspondence. You seem a good man, an educated man. There are things in these mountains that educated men do not understand because they have not seen, have not lived here where the old darkness still holds sway." It had been kindly meant, Jonathan understood that, but also frustrating. He'd spent 5 days traveling to reach this place, carried documents worth a small fortune in potential commissions, represented a firm that had entrusted him with their most important foreign client. What was he supposed to do? Turn back because some villagers trafficked in gothic ghost stories? He'd thanked the landlord politely but firmly, explained that his business was essential and his client expecting him, and retired to his room with the remainder of the wine and a determination not to let superstitious nonsense undermine his professional responsibility. The crucifix the old woman had given him lay on the nightstand where he'd placed it, silver gleaming in the lamplight, and after a moment's hesitation he'd hung it around his neck beneath his shirt, telling himself it was merely to avoid offense, to show respect for local customs, even as some deeper instinct whispered that respect had nothing to do with it, that the weight of the small cross against his chest felt like protection, like a talisman against something his rational mind refused to acknowledge, but his body, older and wiser than reason, already feared. He'd slept poorly, dreams full of vast wings and glowing eyes, and woken to a grey morning with the mountains wreathed in mist. The day had passed with agonizing slowness. He'd attempted to work, reviewing the property documents, making notes about the Count's requirements, but found his concentration fragmenting, his attention drawn repeatedly to the window and the peaks beyond, to the castle he couldn't see but knew was there, waiting. Lunch sat heavy and unwelcome in his stomach. At 2:30 he'd settled his bill, the landlord accepting payment with a mournful expression and a muttered phrase that might have been a blessing or a farewell. His trunk had already been loaded onto the coach that waited in the inn's courtyard, a large old-fashioned vehicle that seemed to belong to a previous century, all dark wood and heavy suspension, drawn by 4 powerful horses that stamped and snorted in the cold air. The driver had been sitting motionless on the high seat, wrapped in a heavy cloak and wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face completely. He hadn't spoken when Jonathan approached, hadn't acknowledged him at all, and for a moment Jonathan had wondered if perhaps this was the wrong coach, but then the door had swung open from inside, apparently on its own, though probably the driver had released some mechanism, and there was nothing to do but climb in and settle himself on the worn velvet seats and feel the whole conveyance rock as the driver released the brake and urged the horses forward. They'd left Bistritz through the eastern gate, the road climbing almost immediately into the foothills. Jonathan had watched through the window as the town fell away behind them, the last outpost of ordinary life growing smaller and smaller until a curve in the road took it from view entirely. The landscape became wild with startling rapidity, the cultivated fields giving way to dense forest, the road narrowing to a track barely wide enough for the coach, pines pressing close on either side. The afternoon light had a strange quality here, filtered through the forest canopy and the ever-present mist, turning everything grey-green and slightly unreal. As the sun sank lower, the driver had begun urging the horses faster, snapping the reins with increasing urgency, and the coach swayed and bounced over the rough road at a pace that seemed dangerous. Jonathan had tried calling up to ask him to slow down, but either the driver didn't hear or chose not to respond. The shadows lengthened and merged, twilight coming early here in the deep valleys between the peaks, and just as Jonathan was about to insist more forcefully that they moderate their speed, the coach had burst from the forest into a clearing where crossroads met and another vehicle waited. This second coach was even larger than the first, black as coal, its team of horses enormous and strangely still. A figure stood beside it, tall and motionless, and as Jonathan's coach thundered to a halt, this figure had stepped forward. The original driver had turned for the first time, and Jonathan had caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hat's brim, young, terrified, pale as death. He'd been about to speak when the newcomer approached, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman, and called up in a voice deep and accented, "You are expected. The Count sends his apologies for the transfer, but the mountain roads beyond this point are treacherous and require someone familiar with their dangers. Your trunk is being moved. Please, step down and make yourself comfortable in the Count's own carriage." There had been something wrong about the scene. Jonathan had felt it immediately, a wrongness that went beyond mere strangeness. The original driver had refused to meet his eyes, had sat frozen on his seat as though paralyzed. The horses of both coaches had been breathing heavily, yet they made no sound, no whinnying or stamping. The clearing itself felt unnatural, perfectly circular, the trees around it uniform in height as though planted rather than grown, and the temperature had dropped precipitously, his breath misting in air that minutes before had been mild. But what choice did he have? His trunk was indeed being transferred by the tall figure who moved it with impossible ease as though it weighed nothing. The black coach door stood open. Behind him, the road back to Bistritz was hours of mountain track through gathering darkness. Ahead lay his destination, his client, his professional obligation. Jonathan had stepped down and across and up into the black coach, and the moment he'd settled onto its seats, softer and more luxurious than the first coach, the door had closed with a decisive click, the tall figure had mounted to the driver's seat, and they'd launched forward with such sudden speed that Jonathan was thrown back against the cushions. Through the rear window he'd caught a final glimpse of the original coach and driver, already diminishing in the distance as they fled back toward town, and then they'd rounded a curve and there was only the road ahead, climbing now in earnest, switchback after switchback rising toward the high peaks. The speed was incredible, impossible, the horses galloping at a pace no team should sustain, taking the curves with a precision that seemed supernatural, and the driver never slowing, never hesitating. Night fell completely, the moon rising late and full, and in its light Jonathan had seen the landscape becoming increasingly barren, the trees giving way to rock and scree, the road narrowing to a ledge carved from the mountain's flank with dizzying drops to one side. He'd tried the door and found it locked or jammed. He'd called up to the driver and received no response. There was nothing to do but endure, gripping the seat as the coach swayed and rocked, watching through the window as they climbed higher and higher into regions that seemed to exist beyond the reach of normal time and space. And then he'd seen them, shapes moving alongside the coach, keeping pace despite the incredible speed. Wolves, he'd thought at first, but they were too large, too fast, running with a coordination that seemed almost intelligent. Their eyes caught the moonlight and threw it back in glowing points of green and gold. There were dozens of them, a pack flowing through the rocks and stunted bushes like water, and their presence seemed to excite the horses to even greater speed. Jonathan had pulled back from the window, heart hammering, rational thought fragmenting under the onslaught of impossibilities, and it was then that the driver had laughed, a sound that carried clearly over the thunder of hooves and wind, a laugh that held no human warmth, only a kind of savage joy. The road had leveled somewhat, running now across a high plateau, and ahead Jonathan had seen it finally, the castle, rising from a promontory of rock like an extension of the mountain itself, all sharp angles and crumbling battlements, vast and ancient and utterly isolated. The wolves had fallen away as they approached, melting back into the shadows as though dismissed, and the coach had clattered across a wooden bridge that spanned some invisible chasm and through an archway into a courtyard where it finally stopped. For a long moment Jonathan had sat in the sudden silence, breathing hard, trembling from the sustained fear and adrenaline of the journey. Then the door had opened, not from outside but released by some mechanism, and cold air had poured in, carrying a scent of stone and age and something else, something organic and wrong. He'd forced himself to move, to step down on shaking legs, and found himself alone in the courtyard, the driver and coach already gone, though he hadn't heard them depart. Nothing around him but stone walls rising to the night sky and a massive door bound in black iron. That door had opened as he approached it, swinging inward without a sound, revealing a vast entrance hall lit by candles in ancient sconces, and there, descending a broad stone staircase with slow, deliberate steps, had been the figure of a man, tall and thin, dressed in black from head to foot, his face pale as marble, his features sharp and aristocratic, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and see directly into Jonathan's soul. He'd reached the bottom of the stairs and crossed the hall with that same fluid grace the coach driver had possessed, and as he'd stepped into the candlelight, Jonathan had seen his face clearly for the first time, ageless and cruel and hungry, framed by dark hair shot through with silver, and when he'd smiled, his lips had pulled back to reveal teeth that were too white, too sharp, especially the canines that seemed abnormally long. "Welcome to my home," the Count had said, his voice deep and cultured. The English perfect but accented in a way Jonathan couldn't place, old-fashioned in its formality. "Enter freely and of your own will. I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in, the night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." He'd extended his hand, and Jonathan, operating on automatic courtesy drilled by years of professional training, had reached out to accept the greeting. The Count's hand had been cold as ice, the grip strong enough to grind bones, and the flesh had felt wrong, not soft like living tissue but hard, almost leathery. Jonathan had looked down involuntarily and seen that the hand was strange, the palm almost hair, the fingers longer than normal, the nails grown to points and sharp as claws. He'd looked up again, into those burning eyes, and seen something there that stopped his breath, a vast intelligence coupled with an even vaster hunger, the look of a predator assessing prey, and behind it an emptiness that seemed to stretch back through centuries, through countless dark years of existence that had worn away everything human and left only appetite. "Come," the Count had repeated, releasing his hand and gesturing toward the stairs. "You must be exhausted from your journey. I have prepared rooms for you, a meal, everything necessary for your comfort. Tomorrow we shall discuss business, but tonight, rest and recovery. You are safe here. You are my guest, and nothing in this house shall harm you. I give you my word." He'd smiled again, that terrible smile, and somewhere deep in the castle Jonathan had heard a sound like a woman crying, or perhaps laughing, he couldn't tell which, and the Count's eyes had flickered toward the sound with an expression of annoyance before returning to Jonathan with renewed intensity. "The wind," the Count had said, "plays strange tricks in these old stones. Come, let me show you to your chambers." And Jonathan had followed, placing one foot in front of the other, climbing those broad stairs, walking deeper into the castle, because what else could he do? The door behind him had closed with the finality of a tomb ceiling, the sound echoing through halls that seemed to stretch away into infinite darkness. Somewhere far above, that crying, laughing sound came again, and the Count's hand, resting lightly on Jonathan's shoulder with a familiarity that felt like ownership, had tightened briefly, the pressure just short of pain. "Pay no attention to the night sounds," the Count had murmured, his mouth close to Jonathan's ear, his breath cold against his neck. "These mountains are full of noises. The wolves, the wind, the settling of ancient stones. You will grow accustomed to them. We have so much time ahead of us, you and I. So very much time to come to understand one another." The corridor they walked was lined with portraits, faces from previous centuries watching with dead eyes as they passed, and Jonathan found himself looking for any that resembled the Count, seeking evidence of family lineage, of ancestors. But what he saw instead was the same face appearing again and again across different periods, the same burning eyes staring from frames dated 1690, 1580, 1492, impossibly the same. And when he'd stopped before one portrait, dated 1456, showing a military commander in armor standing amid scenes of battle and bloodshed, the Count had paused as well. "My ancestor," the Count had said softly, "though we are told I bear a strong resemblance. He was a warrior in his time, a defender of his land against invaders, though history has not always been kind to his memory. We do what we must to survive, do we not, Mr. Harker? We adapt, we endure, we take what is necessary to continue, regardless of the cost to others. It is the privilege of the strong, the right of those with the will to seize immortality from the jaws of death itself." The words had made no sense, yet perfect sense, and Jonathan had felt the crucifix beneath his shirt, warm against his skin, the only warmth in a castle that seemed built from ice and shadow. They'd reached a door, heavy oak bound with iron, and the Count had opened it to reveal a chamber that was surprisingly comfortable, a fire burning in the hearth, a table laid with food and wine, a bed made up with clean linens, his trunk already placed at the foot of it, though he hadn't heard anyone bring it up. "I trust you will find everything satisfactory," the Count had said from the doorway. "I regret I cannot join you for the meal. I have already dined, and my own needs are specific. Rest tonight. Tomorrow evening, when you have recovered from your journey, we shall begin our work together. The documents you have brought, the properties in London, these represent my future, Mr. Harker, my new life in your modern world. I have such plans, such hunger for what your city offers. So many souls crowded together, so much warm blood flowing through those teeming streets, such rich feeding." He'd paused, seeming to realize something wrong in his phrasing. "Such rich opportunity for investment, I mean to say. Commercial investment. You understand?" Jonathan had nodded, mute, and the Count had smiled one final time and withdrawn, pulling the door closed. Jonathan had stood frozen for long minutes, listening to footsteps receding down the corridor, impossibly hearing them continue long after they should have faded beyond range, down the stairs, through distant halls, descending to what depths he couldn't imagine. Only when the silence returned completely had he moved, crossing to the table, looking at the food without appetite, pouring wine with a trembling hand and drinking it too fast, feeling the warmth spread through his chest without dispelling the cold that had settled into his bones. The window of his chamber looked out over the vast empty darkness of the mountains, no lights visible for miles in any direction, nothing but rock and forest and the terrible isolation of this place that seemed to exist outside the world, beyond the reach of help or hope. Jonathan set down the wine glass and pulled the crucifix from beneath his shirt, holding it in both hands, this small piece of silver given by a frightened woman in a market town that seemed a lifetime ago though it had been merely hours. Tomorrow he would examine the situation in daylight, would attempt reasonable conversation, would perhaps discover that tonight's terrors were merely the product of exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings and too much imagination. Tomorrow. But as he stood at the window, watching the moon track across the sky, he saw movement on the wall below, impossible yet unmistakable. A figure, dark against the pale stone, moving horizontally across the sheer vertical face of the castle with the ease of a lizard, defying every law of nature and physics. The figure wore black, moved with that fluid predatory grace, and as Jonathan watched in paralyzed horror, it began climbing downward, head first, body adhering to the stone through some impossible mechanism, descending toward an opening in the lower levels from which a faint phosphorescent glow emanated. The Count. Jonathan's mind supplied uselessly. The Count crawling down his castle wall like an insect, like something that had never been human or had long ago surrendered its humanity for something older and darker. And as the figure disappeared into the lower opening and the night swallowed all evidence of what he'd seen, Jonathan Harker, solicitor's clerk, rational man of the modern age, finally admitted to himself the truth that every instinct had been screaming since the moment he'd grasped that cold hand in the entrance hall. He was a prisoner in this place. A guest perhaps in name, but a prisoner in fact. And his host, the Count, the nobleman, the client who had seemed so sophisticated and modern in his letters, was something else entirely, something that cast no reflection, something that crawled on walls. But leaving, Jonathan understood now.